and welcome to Newsroom. We're live from Islamabad with Sharmeen Ali. Today we're going to talk about our main stories, which are namely that the UN Security Council has held another meeting about Kashmir, and this happened on Wednesday, yesterday. And this is very significant because the last meeting held by the UN Security Council on Kashmir was in August 16th, and that was the first time that a meeting by the UN Security Council has taken place on this issue of Kashmir since 1965. And because of the situation right now in the occupied valley of Indian occupied Kashmir, since August 5th, then when Articles 370 and 35A were revoked by the Indian government, the situation there has been very tense, and there are massive human rights violations, which the UN Security Council has also, the UN Secretary General has expressed his concerns about as well. And also the LOC violations by the Indian side have also apparently been discussed. We're going to talk about that in our program today. We're also going to be talking about the new US-China trade deal, which has just recently come about as a huge relief to businesses all over the world. Of course, the trade tensions, the trade war tensions for the last 2 years between the two countries had a lot of businesses on the edge in both sides of the world, particularly in the US, where the consumers and businesses bore the brunt of this trade war. So we're going to talk about the developments in that. And we're also going to be talking about how the US House of Representatives has voted 228 to 193 to actually send 2 charges against President Donald Trump to the Senate, which are abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. So we'll be talking about that briefly as well. So let's begin with our program now about the UN Security Council meeting that has taken place in New York, and about Kashmir. And Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has also met top UN leaders over there on his way to Washington, D.C. to meet Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Let's have a look.
Foreign Minister told the UN Secretary General that India is not willing for bilateral negotiations over Kashmir issue. The UN Secretary General reiterated the importance of maintaining peace and stability in South Asia through political dialogue, diplomatic solution, and respect for human rights. Talking to media after a meeting with the UN chief, he said Pakistan is sincere for bilateral talks on Kashmir. However, India is backtracking. He said the human rights violations are at peak in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and urged the international community to play its role in settling the dispute according to the United Nations resolutions. The foreign minister also held a meeting with President of the UN Security Council, Dang Din Quay, in New York. He thanked the Security Council's president for highlighting the Kashmir issue in the council's meeting, as lockdown slapped on the Himalayan territory has passed nearly 5 months since. The foreign minister said it's the second time in 5 months that the Security Council discussed the Kashmir issue. He urged the Security Council to act decisively to prevent a disastrous war between Pakistan and India, to call for an end to the grave human rights violations in occupied Kashmir. During his meeting with UN General Assembly President Tijani Muhammad Bande, the foreign minister discussed a range of issues, including recent trends and developments at the global and regional levels. The foreign minister briefed the UN General Assembly President over the systematic human rights abuses in occupied Kashmir. It was agreed that the United Nations remained an indispensable institution for advancing dialogue, cooperation, and pursuing collective solutions to global challenges. The foreign minister underscored the need for the UN to ensure implementation of United Nations Security Council resolutions on Kashmir issue.
So indeed, that's a major development. We'll now introduce our guests in our studio. We have with us Mr. Omar Hayat Abbasi, who's a foreign relations expert. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us again on our program. This is a very big step again that the UN Security Council is discussing Kashmir. We know that this is a topic which is seldom discussed in the Security Council, and the first time it's been discussed since 1965 was in last August. So your comments on this, sir?
Well, first of all, Sharmeen, thank you very much. I'd like to be a little critical about the UN, United Nations in particular. See, when we have to go back in the history, after World War II, after the failure of League of Nations, United Nations was established. Now, it was somehow effective in resolving some benign disputes in different parts of the world before the Cold War. But when we see the Cold War, the world was bipolar. There was on one side USSR, on the other side the world and different countries of the world were led by the United States. So there was non-aligned movement. I agree with that, but those non-aligned movement was actually not non-aligned countries. They were by one way or the other connected with either of the two blocks, if we look in the history. But after the end of the Cold War, the world shaped into unipolarity with US as the sole superpower of the country. Now, if we see United Nations and all its organs, whether that is General Assembly or United Nations Security Council, in 21st century, we won't be able to see the effectiveness of United Nations as such on different long-standing disputes, including Kashmir, which is there for the last more than 70 years, or let's say Palestinian issue, or different issues in Africa. There are many issues who are still unresolved beside number of resolutions by General Assembly and
with
Security
Kashmir,
Council.
72 years have gone by.
More than 72 years.
A lot of time has gone by.
And then we have to go beyond that and see what's going on the globe in 21st century after 2000. The dynamics have changed. No, there's no unipolar world as such. I don't see that. And the second segment, you're going to talk about China-US trade deal, and that brings us to a serious question whether the world truly is unipolar anymore or not. So what I see now, I'm very critical about United Nations and all its organs and all its different bodies were somehow now they've shaped into an organization which was primarily designed to resolve the dispute for the peaceful coexistence on the planet, has now moved to more of an NGO who is into charity work and recommendations and report writings. So it has there is no binding on the parties who are actually even in the US. If you see after Iraq War, case of Iraq War, and number of other incidences when the superpowers, specifically the United States, has bulldozed number of resolutions of United Nations Security Council. So this actually has a trickle-down effect on a lot of other countries, including our neighbor India. So whatever now is going on in United Nations Security Council or United Nations in general on this platform, it is more about what happens later after these forums. So it's about interpretation. So you come up and give your narrative and twist it and give your interpretation, and the other party will simply come up and give their interpretations and their twists, and they'll add to their story. So it's not about execution of those resolutions. It's not effective. Those resolutions are not effective.
It's more like a hearing. It's
They're
apparently
not
it was a meeting. There was a meeting
unfortunately.
behind closed doors, and the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Zhang Jun, he confirmed that the council had reviewed the situation in occupied Kashmir. So the public doesn't even have access to what was discussed over there.
See, it's a lot of, there's a lot of skepticism involved in such kind of meetings. One is closed door meetings. Two is when after the meeting, if you see Indian envoy in the United Nations, he has given his own twist into what's going on, and Pakistanis are giving their own perspective on what's going on. What do we actually need? Are we going to promote our narratives? India's promoting Indian narrative, and Pakistan is promoting Pakistani narrative. China is promoting Chinese narrative. Forget about all these narratives. Let's focus on one single point agenda, and that is people are suffering in Indian occupied Kashmir, and that's a brutal siege, and the people are losing their lives, and they do not have access to the basic facilities of life, and these are the serious questions. So it's about reviewing and report writing and all that. Look, there was one important thing in this meeting. United Nations Military Observer Group in Pakistan and India was supposed to submit their report, and that report was supposed to be discussed. We haven't really heard anything particularly about that, and that's really unfortunate, because that report was actually going to highlight the true and real human rights violation that are going on in Indian occupied Kashmir.
And also, that would also include the ceasefire violations, the line of control firing, etc., the loss of lives of the civilians in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and military, etc. So that is a very crucial aspect of all of this.
That is what we need to address.
This is where a flashpoint can take place, because the two countries can start a war that way.
I don't want to sound pessimistic, but pragmatic frankly, what's important? It's the lives, human lives are more important. So we need to have the stories from ground, what's going on in India, and then tell the world. So I completely agree with the fact that Pakistan and Pakistan's foreign policy and diplomacy has highlighted Kashmir dispute. It was dormant in the last few decades, but now it's in the spotlight. All media houses are talking
But so
about
what
it.
we're seeing is, okay, we're seeing the media houses talking about it. We're seeing a lot of foreign governments talking about it. We've seen US congressional hearings about it. And this is the second meeting of the Security Council. However, and now Alice Wells was just in New Delhi as well, and she expressed her concerns about this situation. Now, what action do we hope to see out of all of this?
Well, I will not be pretty hopeful about it, unfortunately. It might sound a little pessimistic, but what I project or what I would advocate for is restructuring of the power structure that exists in the world, and that I see United Nations is no more effective if we have to see the dynamics of 21st century. So probably the intellectuals and the leaders of the world need to once again sit down and figure out how the power sharing and the power structures need to be redesigned in 21st century without any conflict. So what's unfortunate, United Nations was created as a result of a very large scale conflict, World War I and II, but this time around, are we not going to learn from our history and sit down the way United States and China are sitting down to settle their trade disputes? Are we not going to sit down and see how do we want to see the globe and the disputes in the globe? Because you see what? Now, what led the world to create the United Nations was actually what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Are we going to expect that? Because now there is a possibility of a small miscalculation and a small mistake that can lead the entire world into a disastrous conflict. If that miscalculation, for example, any sort of miscalculation that takes place between India and Pakistan, both nuclear rivals, and this entire region is like 4 or 5 nuclear powers, including China, Russia, Pakistan, and India. So any miscalculation or any mistake, can we afford that? Can the planet afford that? So it's about you
Absolutely
can't
not.
be indifferent anymore. Look, there is an indifference. I see there are statements coming from different regions of the world. I see the international media writing about it. I see intellectuals talking about it. But are we not going to sit down and figure out this dispute needs to be resolved once and for all?
Right.
And that has to go beyond what we have.
Well,
I'm sorry, let me complete. What we now restrict ourselves when there is a rise of nationalism in all democratic societies of Asia and Europe. What we now need to do is go probably beyond that, beyond national interest and the conception of national interest, and think about the global interest, which is more important because we can't see the globe under any kind of threat.
Right. Okay. We now have also with us, joining us, Ms. Asma Shakir Khwaja, who's an international affairs expert. Thank you, Ms. Asma, for joining us online.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, your feedback about this UN Security Council meeting that took place yesterday, what do you think we're going to gain out of this meeting about Kashmir?
See, I think it would be a bit difficult to assume so much from this one meeting. But what we can achieve, that the most important thing is that Kashmir issue, Kashmir conflict has been discussed on this world's most esteemed forum, which talks about, which try to resolve conflict. So our success is that international forums are still discussing Kashmir and considering Kashmir as an important conflict which need to be addressed and resolved. So I think it is a good it is an optimistic move, especially for the Kashmiri people and individuals.
Right. The UN Security, the Secretary General of the UN on August 8th, in his statement, he said that the position of the United Nations is governed by the Charter of the United Nations and applicable Security Council resolutions. And he said that he's concerned over reports of the restrictions on the Indian side of Kashmir, which could exacerbate the human rights situation in the region. Now, all of these human rights situations and all must have been discussed in this meeting, because that is the key factor that everybody is trying to point out. Pakistan has also been highlighting this. It's now the 6th month started that they have this internet blackout.
Yes, and this I think on Indian for Indian government it's a failure on their part that their policies of subjugation and denial of human rights in Kashmir are highlighting the that the Kashmiris are not with India, and it is more as a, that is why Indian government is scared of freedom of speech. But let me tell you, I was it was a good move when I saw that U.S. Department of State had issued a tweet when Indian government took different ambassadors of different countries to Kashmir, and the U.S. government also stated that they are looking forward towards the normalization of situation in Kashmir. So even that fake or like I would say staged, manufactured visit to give an impression that everything is fine in Kashmir could not bring desired results for Indian government. And ambassadors themselves, they saw that how life is being paralyzed in Kashmir for last 5 months only only to push people to accept the draconian laws and policies and decisions of Indian government without the consent and without the will of Kashmiri people. The issue of human rights is definitely important, and when UN, as we all know, that the UN assured Kashmiri people that their right to choose would be respected, and they would choose it through a plebiscite that what they want to do with their homeland. So UN at UN forums, different forums, again and again when they are talking about Kashmir and issues related to the Kashmir conflict, it gives me hope. It is a hope for Kashmiris as well that at least they are not deaf,
Right.
and the international community is discussing and talking about their problem. And now it depends upon, I think, Pakistan that how proactively, wisely they can utilize those potentials and opportunities in a most optimum manner. So it
Right.
depends upon Pakistan. We need to be more assertive, more aggressive, and we need to share the plight of Kashmiris with the international community and international and at international forums. Those international forums are really important to build an image of the conflict. As India was trying to build an image of the conflict that everything is fine in Kashmir, but it is we should appreciate the efforts of government of Pakistan that now world has this image with Kashmir conflict that everything is not right in Kashmir. The Kashmiri people have been mistreated by the Indian government and things are not normal. And when things are not normal, it means that the colonial occupation of India of Kashmir is also not normal.
Ma'am,
It is
what
not accepted
your
by.
views on now the Indian narrative has always been that this is a bilateral issue that has to be resolved between India and Pakistan. And what do you, in your feedback on this narrative of India's that this is purely a
See,
bilateral issue? Now it's being discussed
yeah.
in all these forums.
Yeah, if we see last 72 years, Pakistan again and again offering India to resolve this issue bilaterally.
Right.
In Shimla agreement, the both countries they agreed upon to bilaterally resolve this issue. But Indian denial to initiate negotiations, talks with Pakistan to resolve Kashmir conflict is itself denial of the spirit of bilateralism. So it is India which is denying the bilateral solution of Kashmir. Otherwise, India would accept Pakistan's offers to talk and resolve and move forward on Kashmir issue. So when India says they, I think it is their policy is in complete dichotomy and contrast. What they say, their actions do not substantiate what they are saying. If they are claiming that Kashmir is a bilateral problem, that why they are not initiating bilateral talks with Pakistan to resolve Kashmir problem. So it
Right.
means that then Indians need to clarify their policies on Kashmir, and this aggressive policy in Kashmir, as the former Raw Chief Mr. Dullat Singh stated in one of his interviews, that this aggressive policy of Indian government or Modi government in Kashmir would never ever bring any good results for India, because it would disengage more Kashmiris with India, and all what is happening for last few months in Kashmir. It is a very good indicator to tell the outer world that Kashmiris are not with India. Right now, you cannot find a single politician in Kashmir or single Kashmiri politician who supports Indian policies, Modi's policies towards Kashmir right now. So this is a big setback on the for Indian government, and the only problem is they are not either realizing it or they don't want to realize it, and
Right.
their I would say their urge and obsession to maintain Hindu radical vote bank with them is
Right, right.
really a thing which is hampering the rationality of Indian government.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Asma Shakir Khwaja. Now, Umar Sahab, we were just hearing what Ms. Asma was saying. Now, as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, China has clearly said that their position is very clear. They said that they recognize Kashmir as a territory that's disputed and they support Pakistan's demand for a plebiscite. What about the other countries? What is their stand going to be in these meetings, in your opinion?
No, wait. I first want to talk about the bilateral narrative of India, if you allow
Sure.
me. See, India says that it's not an international dispute, and partly we are responsible. It is because of our failed diplomacy that we have had in the last few decades that India has been so successful in promoting its narrative that Pakistan and India need to resolve Kashmir issue bilaterally, and that it's ignoring United Nations Security Council resolutions, that it's a bilateral dispute. It's not, in fact. Now, when we move forward and see, okay, let's talk about it bilaterally, India does not really agree on sitting down with Pakistan and negotiating Kashmir dispute, blaming and evading and excusing, and they kind of avoid kind of bilateral agreements or bilateral talks. Now, what happened after they revoked Article 370 and 35A and special status of Jammu and Kashmir, when the issue was raised in the United Nations Security Council, the representative came out in the public and said, we're willing to talk with Pakistan as per Simla Accord and Lahore Resolution of 1999. Now, what is interesting is that, look, what's happening in the world right now, that even the US cannot decide unilaterally, and it had to ultimately sit down with China and figure out how they're going to resolve the disputes. Because
Absolutely.
unilateralism by any country, even the most powerful country of the world, United States, unilateralism or this kind of state of mind in the policy is not going to be workable in 21st century. India needs to understand this first, that okay, we agree it's a bilateral dispute. Let's go and let's put ourselves in their shoes and say, okay, fine, it's a bilateral dispute. Let's sit down. Unilateralism, you are practicing unilateralism, and then on different international forums, you're promoting and advocating bilateral dispute, and that's bilateral. But when it comes to any kind of bilateral negotiations, you kind of skip and sidestep from any kind of bilateral. So it's an inherent contradiction. What about the rest of the world? Let me answer your question. You don't forget this question.
Yeah,
you're gonna
exactly.
ask.
To wind
What
up
about
this topic.
what about the rest of the world? It's probably because we have a lot of hopes from United Nations Security Council, and I tell you, that's my assessment. The UN is not an effective body to resolve international dispute. What Pakistan needs to do is probably stretch ourselves beyond these international forums and go and connect with the countries in Latin America and Guatemala and with Chile, with Brazil, and expand ourselves and improve ourselves economically. And tell the world that we are also stakeholders, serious stakeholders. Why the world does not really listen so carefully, and they don't really buy your narrative and push India to resolve Kashmir issue, because they have their economic stake in India. So that's probably we need to focus more on and tell the world that we also are a market, and that we are serious in our developing in our economy, and that we are a serious stakeholder in the world. We have to probably go beyond narratives and beyond statements and tweets, and we have to do something on ground and practical and tangible term that attracts the words to us, and that we become a stakeholder and we negotiate with the rest of the world. So it is linked with our diplomacy, and also it is directly linked with how we are taking care of our domestic affairs and how we are progressing. It includes our GDP,
Economically,
it includes our
Absolutely. That's key as
Human
well.
Development Index, it includes all those indicators. So we have to improve on that and tell the world that we are also
So
serious
economic
narrative.
uplift is as important. So now
Economic and political stability, both.
Absolutely. So our next story is about the US-China trade deal that's that's just taken place on Wednesday, which has come as a sigh of relief for businesses worldwide. And this is after 2 years of tensions between the United States and China. Let's have a look.
The US and China have signed an agreement aimed at easing a trade war that has rattled markets and weighed on the global economy. The US President Donald Trump said the pact would be transformative for the US economy. Meanwhile, Chinese leaders call it a win-win deal that would help foster better relations. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He signed the deal on behalf of China. The agreement was rooted in equality and mutual respect and defended his country's economic model. Both the countries will share enormous common commercial interests. China has agreed to buy about $40 billion worth of agricultural products from the US over the next 2 years. There is a little substance, but the signing offers puts an opportunity for US President Donald Trump to put the trade war behind him and claimed an achievement heading into the 2020 presidential elections. President of China claimed that he didn't simply bow to America's demands. The Federal Reserve estimates that China's economy has taken a 0.25% hit as the US demands for its goods fell by about a third. Economists have found that the cost more than $40 billion so far are being borne entirely by US companies and consumers, and that figure does not even try to measure lost business due to retaliation.
Right. So we saw this report about the US-China trade deal. So Umar Saab, now I'd like to ask you that the remarks that President Trump made about this was that today we take a momentous step, one that's never taken before with China, that will ensure fair and reciprocal trade. Your comments on this? Is this going to be fair and reciprocal trade?
See, there are a few comments I want to talk about it. One, China has for long been talking about great power relationship. So 10, 15 years ago, it was unilateral decisions on the part of the US, and then with the economic rise and development in China, and with the dependencies of both economies, China is I would not term it as a trade deal between United States and China. I would call Trump's effort of trade balancing between India and China, and that's going to give a sigh of relief to the farmers and different stakeholders in US for the next 2 or 3 years or 4 years. Now, why I say this is because, you know, it was not unilateral decision. It was a unilateral decision, and US has been trying to avoid this kind of situation. But then there is no avoidance to the rise of China, so they had to, at the end of the day, accept that China is rising, and they have to sit down. So I would term it Chinese success. But it's because of political compulsions that Trump has. He needs to do something. That's why what he did was killing General Qasem Soleimani. He wants to just show his constituents, you know, that I'm doing something. But these efforts might help him in the coming election, but it's not going to, if I'm not an expert in economy, but whatever limited understanding I have, it's not going to really have any benefit for the American economy as such. It's going to, in the long run, benefit China, because they made US sit down on a table and let's talk about it and let's negotiate. This in itself is a victory for China, whatever that war was going on, fair enough.
Because the trade war was affecting American businesses a lot as well. They had to switch around their manufacturers, and also the US consumers got affected because the Chinese products which they were previously getting were a better price, etc., than they were getting them from other regions in the world. So things became a lot more expensive for the consumer, and this in the middle of an election year right now, where everything is about consumers and how their life has affected the US public.
It might give small relief for the US consumers and their firms in the next 2 to 3 years. But here's the thing, there is an inherent problem between Chinese and Americans sitting down together and negotiating on trade. Why? Because US is a capitalist economy. China is neither capitalist nor communist economy. It's rather a blend. So I would always tell my American students that, listen, why are you so overwhelmed with framing Chinese economic model in your capitalist terms or capitalistic economic terms? So there is a Chinese economic model. So even if we have to see from a free market economy perspective, I would tell you, even if it's about importing Chinese products in the US or it's about exporting US products in China, in both cases, there is a fundamental principle. It's about free market. So it's about what market is going to sustain what kind of products and for how long. And it's competitive. When we call
But
free
Chinese
market, it's
leaders-
going to be competitive. So in both cases, it's not just US economy that's suffering. Though both countries are so, both economies, I wouldn't say both countries, both economies are so strongly interdependent. So it's about what I started off with, that it's about both countries need to sit down, and probably now we are heading towards acceptance of the fact that China is going to be an economic might because it has made US sit down and negotiate on economic terms.
Right.
That might help US and its firms and the consumers for some time, but how about the long run in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years? How are they going to address that?
Right. Okay. So Chinese leaders have been talking about their commitment to free trade. They've been talking about open markets and about globalization. So you're talking about a free market. That is what Chinese leaders are talking about. But at the same time, the Chinese firms are also trying to lessen their dependence on America, and they have this vision of being self-sufficient as far as technology and all are concerned within China.
Yeah, they are actually within China, but that actually, whatever the technology or technological advancement in real comes from the West. And that's what really disturbs American businesses, tech-based businesses, when they want to ensure that there is no copyright violation and all that. But this also has an inherent problem, Sharmeen, how that is. See, there was in 1945, only one country had nuclear weapon, but in 2019, we have almost 10 countries on the planet who have nuclear weapons. So it's about once a human species, humans have learned to create something, no matter what kind of regimes, control regimes you introduce, the other humans are going to learn that. So the I would call the copyright hooks, that they
Right.
want to protect copyrights in the US and they want to protect US firms. It's
Right.
not going to work because
Right.
it's a learning, human species has learned. So it's
Right.
about
At
US
this
has
point,
one smartphone, another country, maybe in Africa, well, if not today, after 10 years later, 15 years later, is going to have that. So copyright protection in Rio is
Absolutely.
not going to work anyway.
Okay, so now Dr. Noor Fatma, who's a political economist, has also joined us online. Thank you for joining us, ma'am. Dr. Noor Fatma, do we have you online? Okay, I think we're having some technical issues getting Dr. Noor Fatma online. So, Umar Saab, what you were saying that just a minute ago, that it's about, you're talking about copyrights at the moment and technology and all. Now, Chinese firms have also said that Chinese companies are dominant in high value manufacturing, and they want to retain that dominance. At the same time, we have, as part of this phase one of the deal, I'd like to just get into now the phases of the deal, is that Beijing has agreed to import an additional $200 billion worth of agricultural products from the US, including $32 billion of agricultural goods. So overall, $200 billion of US products over 2 years, above the levels of 2017 when this trade war started. So how do you see these particular aspects of the deal of being beneficial to the United States?
If we agree on the principle of free market economy, let's say, so it's about the demand that's going to generate supply of the products. Let us say, for example, it's going to lead again towards Chinese monopoly on American farmers or American agricultural products. How I tell you, let's say China agrees that we have a domestic demand of these products and that we're going to buy that from you. So are they not going to, American farmers and agriculture products and agriculture industry going to depend again, considering the size and the population of China, depend on China, and that's going to monopolize the agricultural industry in the US too. there is a basic understanding in free market economy. It's about considering the demand we're going to bring or import that. For example, it's going to reduce the demand within China. China would not really buy things and dump them in the ocean. They'll have to buy if there is a demand in China. Third is, how about Chinese agreements with or trade on agriculture products with a number of other countries? So we can say it might help American agricultural products or firms to somehow give them a sigh of relief for the next year or two. But
Yeah.
when we move on to the next fourth or fifth or sixth year, it's going to again lead to a dead end. And that it's going to be not really so good for American agriculture industry and agricultural products. See, now what's going on? I want to talk a little more on that. China's into small products and small industry. US into heavy manufacturing and heavy industry. Their Boeings and their arms and their different kind of sophisticated weapons and all that. So you can't really depend on that. And then there is agriculture that's also facing a lot of challenges within the US. Even if we consider this deal is going to be beneficial, but it's not going to sustain. It's not going to be beneficial for American agricultural sector for the next more than 5 years. So this is an interim, I would term it as an interim deal, as a sigh of relief for the next 2.5 years. And I think
So
Trump
what,
has
what
really...
other product in those 200 billion in US products do you think is included in this trade deal? There's 28 billion, sorry, 32 billion worth agricultural goods.
It's a bit, US is so self-sufficient and their, food items and all that. So it's about, they're going to supply more of the food items, I would say, soybeans and these kind of food items. I don't exactly know the list of those items, but these are going to be canned food or different kind of food items that they're going to supply. But then they're not going to supply that without a demand. That doesn't really make a sense. So if there is a demand decrease in China, one. If there is a demand decrease, they're not going to buy those products. Two, if there is a demand increase in China, let us say, in that case, they're going to be the biggest buyers of those products from the American firms. So in that case, that's going to give a monopolistic advantage to the Chinese firms. So in both cases, after 2 years, after this, I would not say it's a trade deal. I said in the beginning, it is an effort of trade balancing. So it's a difference. It's not a trade war. It's not a trade deal. It is an effort. It's for trade balancing between China and the US for 2.5 years, 3 years. So it's an interim understanding on how US is probably trying to figure out how they're going to do with the economic rise of China. But look, how about next 5 years if we talk about it, and how the things really are going to favor China? Let me tell you. That's how I see this.
Right, and phase 2 of this deal is going to include cybersecurity and access for US services firms to the Chinese market. So there's another phase is coming. All the tariffs have not been removed as yet that were hurting the economy, the trade war that it was all about tariffs. So all of the tariffs have not been removed as yet because there's further negotiations for the second phase.
So even if the tariffs are not removed, that's not going to harm just one single country. That's going to harm both of them. That's going to harm American economy as well as the Chinese economy, and the rest of the world, the countries and the economies that depend on Chinese and American economy. But here's an interesting thing in this deal, that they've agreed not to really have a third party to resolve any kind of disputes. They've agreed to bilaterally and mutually resolve any kind of disputes that prevail. And one of the major problems that US and the firms in the US had was that if they wanted to have an investment in China or they wanted to expand their business in China, Chinese would have very strict regimes and ask them a lot of information. So that information, disguise of those regulations or the disguise of those regulations for licensing and all that, they had to ultimately at the end of the day reveal their trade secrets because of those regulations. If you ask me what's the win outcome or what's the win for the US in this trade deal, I would say the only single victory or the only single advantage that I have in this trade balancing effort is that US has made China make those laws and regulations in China flexible if there is any US firm who wants to come in and expand and do business in China. So they're not going to ask them a lot of trade secrets and all that. So they're going to have they're going to make those laws a little flexible in China and the process of licensing. So that is going to somehow give a sigh of relief to the American firms who want to come in China and do the business.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Umar Hayat. Atabasi, and for giving us all your feedback on both these very important topics that we're talking about today. And now another very key story that's going on right now in the United States is that the U.S. House of Representatives has voted to send President Donald Trump's impeachment trial to the Senate, and the 100-seat Senate is expected not to convict President Trump because a two-thirds majority is needed, and the 53 Republicans in the Senate have been showing support to President Trump. So the likelihood is that President Trump will not be found guilty and he'll continue on as president, but it's yet to be seen after the voting is complete. And this impeachment inquiry was launched by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in September, and it's gone through several processes, and it's gone through the House of Representatives, and now it's come to the Senate. And the trial that's going to take place in the Senate is going to be overseen by Chief Justice John Roberts. And President Trump's opinion about this is that the entire impeachment trial is a hoax, and a lot of Republicans say that this has been a pure attempt by the Democrats to just malign President Trump, especially in regards to the upcoming elections. And the charges again against President Trump is obstruction of justice and obstruction of Congress, and abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. So that is what we're seeing right now. President Trump's impeachment trial is going to be going to the Senate, and let's see what the outcome is going to be for that in the coming days. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you for watching Newsroom today, and we'll see you next time.